So I think I'm going to go ahead and get started today. Welcome, everyone, to the third lecture of the 2022 Biomedical Research Integrity, or BRI, Summer Lecture Series. My name is Malia Fullerton, and I am Professor of Bioethics and Humanities here at the University of Washington. The United States Public Health Service, or PHS, and its research institutions require that all pre- and postdoctoral researchers supported by PHS training grants receive training in the responsible conduct of research. In addition, the Fred Hutch, with whom we partner as part of this series, requires all of its pre- and postdoctoral researchers to receive such training. The UW and Fred Hutch have developed this program of lectures and linked discussion groups to help its researchers meet this training requirement. So just a few pieces of housekeeping before we begin. Just a reminder that this is a completely virtual program, again, this summer. Attendance credit is tied to the email address that you enter into Zoom. So please remember to use one email address consistently, and please type it correctly. If you cannot attend the lecture live, each lecture will be recorded, as we are recording now, and posted shortly after its live delivery. You will need to view the lecture and take the corresponding short content quiz before you receive credit for attendance. In addition, for those attending UW-based discussion groups, it's an excellent idea to watch or re-review the lecture link to each discussion section before you attend. We are using the Zoom webinar feature here, which allows audience attendees to submit questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of the viewing screen, as opposed to putting things into the chat box. Please feel free to submit your question at any time. You may do so as an identified participant or anonymously if you prefer. Other audience members can read the questions as they come in, and will have the option of upvoting by clicking that thumbs up icon, any question that they're particularly interested in having our speaker answer during the Q&A. Please do not forget to complete the post-lecture evaluation, which will be sent to you in your attendance confirmation email. This is the primary way by which we can tell that you have attended and engaged with the lecture material. All right, with that housekeeping taken care of, it is my real pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Mildred Cho. Dr. Cho is a professor in the Department of Pediatrics, Division of Medical Genetics, and in the Department of Medicine at Stanford University. She received a BS in Life Sciences from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a PhD in pharmacology at Stanford before moving to postdoctoral research in health policy at UC San Francisco. Her major areas of interest are the ethical and social impacts of genetic research and data science and their applications, including AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning for precision medicine, gene therapy, the human microbiome, and synthetic biology. Dr. Cho will be speaking today on the theme related to the PHS required topic of responsible data management, with her title being Data Ethics, Responsibility, and Values. Mildred, thank you so much for being with us. Please take it away.
Thank you. And I just wanted to see of course, my monitor went bleeping out just as are you seeing the right slide? Or are you seeing the other?
Yes,
okay,
we're
good.
seeing the correct slides, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to speak on data ethics. I also wanted to mention that in addition to my role at the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics, I'm a co-director of the Center for LC Resources and Analysis, which stands for Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications of Genetics and Genomics Research. But I just wanted to mention it because it does provide resources on data ethics and other research ethics issues that you may be interested in. So I would encourage you to go to lchub.org to find out more information there. So thanks for indulging me on making a quick pitch for LC Hub. And so I just want to have us think about the question about why we talk about data and ethics. And as we all know, data are the currency of research, and they're very valuable to science. It's what science is built around. And ironically, the more data that we have and the more data that are available, the more valuable it becomes. And data collection and use are not harm-free activities, and the benefits are not necessarily justly distributed. So because of that, that means that people who generate data, collect it, and use it have ethical obligations to the people and the animals and other sources from which data are collected, and the other stakeholders including research funders and the public who are potentially affected by the scientific findings from the data. So I'd like to pose some questions for us to think about throughout the next hour, including what are the responsibilities of those who generate, collect, and use data? To whom do they owe these responsibilities? How are those responsibilities fulfilled? What and whose values are served? And I'll focus on two specific aspects of data that raise ethical issues and questions about responsibility and values that are at stake, including data sharing and data bias. So data sharing. Why do we share data, and why do we have data sharing policies? What values are served by data sharing and those policies about data sharing? What are competing values that must be considered when sharing data and creating and implementing data sharing policies? So why should scientists share data? So this woman, Amanda Bernard of the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization in Australia, gave 10 reasons, which were published recently in Nature Index. And I thought these were an interesting list. They are sort of aimed at scientists, so reasons for scientists to share data. And they kind of go beyond kind of some of the usual reasons that people give for data sharing. So I'll just present some of these to you now. So one of them is maximizing the impact of data through making it available and encouraging readership and citation of it, for example, through DOIs. Secondly, she says it's a way for scientists to get visibility, to stand out from the crowd, be recognized for your work creating that data. Thirdly, she talks about veracity, so making data fair. You may have heard this acronym FAIR: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, because curation of data encourages rigor. Thinking about how to make it usable by other people makes you think about how to make sure it's of high quality. Fourth, she talks about generosity to the scientific community and making you a contributor to the community from which you also reap benefits, which is related to the next principle of reciprocity, which is to treat others the way you would like to be treated, and also that it's more efficient to share data in sort of coordinated and centralized ways than in a case-by-case way. Sixth, she talks about connectivity, so that sharing data is a way to tap into networks of researchers, again, related to reciprocity, but you can benefit by using your data as a way to connect with others. Seventh, relevance, so that having data be widely used and having your data be widely used increases its relevance to the field, and also the relevance of the field, that is through generalizability and increasing generalizability by adding more data to it. And expanding data relevant to you and relevant to the area of study. Eighth is complacency. So letting fresh eyes see data encourages quality, but also questioning assumptions, and so sort of challenging complacency of current thought. Ninth, she talks about legacy, which is that letting others use your data to make new insights builds your own legacy. And 10th, money, saving funders from having to support the same research over and over again, especially if it leads to findings that, negative findings. So we don't want to have to waste money. So you'll notice though that most of these, except for the last one and maybe the first one, are particularly focused on sort of the issues that are related to why data sharing will benefit you as a scientist. But what's the underlying justification, the ethical justification for sharing data? It's because getting and using data are not cost-free. There's many different kinds of costs. There's financial costs, but others. And these costs are borne by institutions that conduct and fund scientific research, but also by data donors and sources, including animals and the public. So this creates obligations to be efficient with resources because the funders, data donors, and the public who pay for research and research infrastructure and bear those costs are entitled to expect the maximum value from their investment. There's also an obligation to minimize harm to humans and animals. And that means sharing data, but also not collecting it unnecessarily. So that's the basis for the 3 R's you might have heard of, which are central to the ethics of use of animals in research. And they mean replace, reduce, and refine, which is shown here in this table from the National Center for the Replacement, Refinement, and Reduction of Animals in Research. On the left are sort of some of the negative obligations that go and that justify these or that go with these 3 R's, such as avoiding or replacing the use of animals. And on the right are positive obligations that justify the 3 R's, most of which are relevant to the generation of data. So the recent impetus for data sharing most recently has been amplified by new information technology, which has in turn led to calls for an open science environment that enables faster and more efficient hypothesis generation and testing. Some have even said that the availability of data and informatics tools obviates the need for hypotheses altogether, such as through a data first approach, which is facilitated by big data. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine articulated a vision for open science in 2018, but the NIH had already started moving in that direction years before that, which has been part of the motivation for new data sharing policies that we'll talk about in a minute. Even the citizen science group DIY Bio, which you might have heard of, had open access as the first item in its code of ethics, which was published in 2011. And that group has the promotion of decentralized access to technology, data, and research tools as its primary goal. So it seems like open science is a thing now, and sharing of data is a central part of that. However, you might already be thinking about barriers to data sharing and reasons why data should not be shared. So these are sort of based on competing values. So for example, in this article on characterizing the biomedical data sharing landscape, these authors pointed out that there are technical, legal, cultural, normative, and policy challenges to data sharing, including interoperability, the influence of academic culture and structure, and ethical issues such as privacy and security. And I'll come back to these later. But first, there are several indicators that show that data are in practice not widely shared. In this recent study that examined public databases such as clinicaltrials.gov, the authors studied data sharing policies of both commercial and non-commercial research funders who supported randomized clinical trials between 2016 and 2018. And they found that 38% of non-commercial funders had a data sharing policy. And the majority, but not all, so 60% of those mandated data sharing, and 41% of commercial funders had a data sharing policy. So of the funders with a data sharing policy, 77% and 81% respectively of the non-commercial or commercially funded studies respectively had a data sharing plan, and 12% or 59% respectively expressed an explicit intention to share data. So clearly, compliance with data sharing policies and transparency about data sharing are not optimal, and non-commercially funded studies, that is academic studies, are performing much more poorly than commercially funded studies in this regard. In this study of over 47,000 articles with a valid data availability statement published in PLOS One between 2014 and 2016, after the journal instituted a policy on data sharing statements. First of all, nearly a quarter of the original sample did not have a valid statement and were not even included in the 47,000 articles. So they did find that of those articles, the 47,000, less than a fifth of them named a specific repository where data would be made available. So as low as that number is, it's actually a lot higher than the estimated 10% of articles that indicated an intention to share data and provided a specific location, which were published in the articles just prior to the institution of the policy. So it went from 10% before the policy to 20% approximately. I think it was 18% afterwards. So that's an improvement, but there's clearly a long way to go. And this table from the article shows the most frequently mentioned repositories from that sample of 47,000 articles. And you can probably see some that you might have used yourself, might have deposited data into yourself. I don't know if you can see the table here, but it includes things like Figshare, Gene Expression Omnibus, GenBank. So many of these may be familiar to you. GitHub, Dataverse, Protein Data Bank, etc. However, note that large repositories are not the only way to share data. Individual data sets are citable and can be assigned DOIs, which will make them more accessible and shareable. So although NIH has had a data sharing policy in existence since 2003, so that's 20 years by now, as well as other institute-specific policies, NIH nevertheless saw the need to update its policy because according to the Office of Science Policy, and many researchers still have not been sharing their data. So the main change to the policy now is that applies not just to grants requesting more than $500,000 in direct costs in a single year, but to any research funded in whole or in part by NIH that generates any data. So the policy does not uniformly require data to be shared in all cases, recognizing that there are situations where data sharing may be inappropriate or even illegal or technically difficult. However, it does allow for requesting funds to cover the costs of data sharing. And it requires that grant applicants submit a data management and sharing plan, which is then reviewed by grant reviewers. So what values are implied in this data sharing policy? This article I'm showing you the picture from is from an article in Nature published earlier this year that describes the new policy, which goes into effect on January 25th of 2023, so in a few months. This article lists justifications for the policy, saying that the mandate aims in part to tackle the reproducibility crisis in scientific research, and goes on to point out that influential cancer studies found that fewer than half of the, it's trying to replicate influential cancer studies, found that fewer than half assessed experiments, half of the assessed experiments stood up to scrutiny. So they tried to tally the cost of irreproducible research in the United States and found that $10 billion to $50 billion is spent on studies that use deficient methods. And point out that the cost is fronted mostly by public funding agencies. However, that the title there that talks about mandating data sharing is not entirely accurate. The NIH expects that all data that are needed to validate and replicate research findings be made available, whether it's associated with publication or not. However, it says that all data used or generated as part of a grant must be managed, but not necessarily that all data should be shared, recognizing that there are times when you should not share data, especially if doing so would violate privacy protections or laws. It also says that ultimately researchers will decide to upload the information. The policy then gives a long list of desirable characteristics of data repositories, which then gives some clues as to the values that the policy is meant to serve, such as sustainability or rigor, as well as the potential of competing values that must be navigated, such as fidelity to consent, privacy, and honoring restrictions on use. These values are in service of the quality and integrity of data and of respecting use restrictions placed on the data, perhaps by those who contributed to it. So the article goes on to describe further justification for the policy in terms of values and obligations, such as avoiding waste of taxpayers' money through irreproducible studies. But it then introduces a couple of other types of values, like undermining public trust and citing the values of transparency and accountability, as well as making good on the nation's investment, which has been cited before. The article also points out some other new different types of trade-offs, including the potential for placing disproportionately heavy burdens on trainees and early career investigators and under-resourced labs. So the policy implicitly and explicitly acknowledges values tensions and tries to thread the needle by not making a blanket requirement for data sharing per se, but to require plans to maximize data sharing to the extent possible, and taking some responsibility for providing financial support to make that happen. So there are other concerns raised by data sharing that are not addressed in depth in the article or in the policy itself, specifically those related to how data are used after sharing and for what purpose. And some of these concerns were highlighted in a lawsuit against the University of Arizona brought by the Havasupai tribe in Arizona and described in the New York Times and in other articles, such as one by a former fellow at Stanford, Nanava Garrison, who was also a former faculty member here at the University of Washington. In 2003, members of the Havasupai tribe discovered that DNA samples that had been collected for genetic studies on type 2 diabetes were also used without their consent for studies on schizophrenia, migration, and inbreeding. The tribe filed a lawsuit in 2004 against the Arizona Board of Regents and the Arizona State University researchers for misuse of genetic materials. The lawsuit articulated concerns about lack of informed consent, violations of civil rights through mishandling of blood samples, unapproved use of data, and violation of medical confidentiality. So eventually, the case settled in 2010 and tribal members received $700,000 for compensation, funds for a clinic and a school, and return of the data samples after the university spent over $1.7 million in legal fees. So the lawsuit and other moratoria, for example, by the Navajo Nation on genetic research or research in general, put tensions over data use and data sharing in stark relief and have led to alternative governance approaches and ethical frameworks. So if you examine frameworks or principles of data sharing, such as the FAIR data principles, you can see that these principles are aimed at the obligations of data generators to data users, but not necessarily to data donors or to the public. So if you look at these 4 principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, you can see how they are really aimed at people who are very close to the data and using it as scientists, but not necessarily honoring values related to other stakeholders. So in contrast, a group of indigenous scholars from several different countries, including the US, developed the CARE principles for indigenous data governance, which are aimed at obligations of data generators and users, but also clearly center the values of others, such as indigenous, including maximizing benefits of data use for the indigenous peoples and equitable participation in data reuse, and thus equitable outcomes. This framework illustrates a different way of looking at data and data sharing and associated values that take into account a broader range of stakeholder values. So although this particular framework was developed by, about, and for Indigenous peoples, it's also an example of other values that might need to be considered in data sharing. For example, benefits to data donors and equity are not values that are strongly articulated in data sharing policies, but are central to the CARE principles. So let's look for a minute at what CARE stands for. CARE stands for collective benefits through supporting community use of data for policy decisions, and creation and use of data that reflect community values. A is for authority to control, which demands not only that Indigenous peoples have access to data, but that they determine data governance protocols and be actively involved in stewardship decisions for Indigenous data that are held by others. So, for example, in some of the other data repositories that we might have mentioned before. R is responsibility for relationships with Indigenous people from whom the data originate. This includes capacity development in the communities to collect, store, and use data, and engaging with communities to determine uses of data that reflect community values and to be involved in stewardship decisions. And E is for ethics in data practices, which are fulfilled by representation and participation of Indigenous peoples in assessment of benefits and harms and potential uses of data, again, based on community values and ethics. So you can see that the CARE principles illustrate a broad range of values that are at stake in data collection and use, as well as sharing, and that significantly expand on and are in tension with the principles and values implied by data sharing policies. So I will just leave you with that as food for thought in your discussions about data sharing, and then turn to the topic of data bias. So this is another important issue in data ethics. And so I'd like us to think about similar questions as we had thought about for data sharing, which is, in addition to what the consequences of bias are, who has responsibility for mitigating bias, what values are served by mitigating the bias, and what are competing values. So first, I want to just define what I mean by bias and try to articulate why we're concerned about it, because people use that term in different ways. So for today's purposes, the types of bias concepts that we are concerned about are both as a statistical concept and as a social or ethical concept. So first, statistically speaking, bias refers to systematic error as distinct from random error and leads to estimates that deviate in a systematic way from the so-called truth. From a social or ethical point of view, bias refers to prejudice or judgments, especially those that lead to unfair treatment, that is, commitment of a moral error, as opposed to a statistical error. In research, we're concerned about both individually, or each individually, but especially about both together, that is, data or analysis that lead to unfair systematic error. So we've probably all heard a lot of horror stories in the media about data bias, especially in data used to develop AI-based predictive models. So here's a recent example from an article I've taken just last week from the Washington Post, in which a data scientist is featured who, and I quote here, fears about bias in artificial intelligence were vividly affirmed in 2017 when a Facebook translation error led to Israeli police to arrest a Palestinian construction worker. The man had posted a picture of himself leaning against a bulldozer with the caption in Arabic, "Good morning." Facebook mistakenly translated it in Hebrew as "attack them." So this incident clearly led to adverse effects because this person was arrested on the basis of algorithm and the error by it. However, the issue of bias is related to data sharing in that it can be exacerbated when people don't share their data and rely instead on what's available, convenient, or cheap. with the idea that larger amounts of data can overcome poor quality or inappropriate data, or that the type of data you use isn't as important as long as there's a lot of it. But remember that some synonyms for big data are found data or digital exhaust, which are not very confidence inspiring in terms of data quality. So some of the ethical issues of data bias arise in the collection of data, which is related to availability and whether the data types are appropriate to the question or problem to be solved. Databases, on the other hand, even if they are large repositories, are not necessarily built with your particular research question in mind. So they're not necessarily made to be appropriate to your research question. So there's a lot of attention recently to data as a source of bias because of the increasing recognition that important data sets are lacking in diversity and can misrepresent relevant populations, whether in the US or worldwide. For example, studies of phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 clinical trials have consistently found underrepresentation of Black, Hispanic, American Indian, Alaska Native, and other subpopulations in the US. Another example that you might be familiar with is from findings of Alice Popejoy and Malia Fullerton, who you know is the organizer of this course, about the widely used GWAS catalog of genome-wide association studies, which showed that there's still a predominance of samples of European origin, shown here on this slide on the right in the Black parts of the pie chart. And you can see that the overall breakdown by ancestry is not at all representative of either global populations or even the US population, and that it has not changed that much over time between 2009 and 2016 in this study. We also know that the lack of diversity in research samples has real clinical implications. So for example, in several studies, patients identified as Black, Asian, Native American, or Hispanic were much more likely than white patients to have a genomic variant of uncertain significance, or VUS, which means that the findings are not interpretable or as pathogenic or non-pathogenic. In one study of patients who had a genetic evaluation of hereditary cancer risk, 42% of Asians received a finding of a variant of uncertain significance compared to 27% of whites. In another study of genetic testing for BRCA1 and BRCA2, 46% of Black women, or nearly half, received a VUS finding compared to 12% of whites. Another study found that in variants of genes associated with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy were more likely to be misclassified in Black patients than in white patients, which could lead to inappropriate care. These authors noted that the errors in variant classification were from a paucity of diverse control data. So these are just two examples of many that indicate how lack of data diversity can have real impacts on health. In other words, how data bias can lead to health disparities. But bias can also be introduced by data collection methods. So in this article on wearable devices, which are used to collect data, the authors point out that the sensors used in these devices use green light to detect heart rate and are known to lack precision and accuracy, or may not read at all when measuring heart rate on people with darker skin, thus are an obvious source of bias. However, these sensors are relatively low cost and easy to use. Therefore, the authors also note that despite the shortcomings of these sensors, green light technology remains the industry standard in wearables. Thus, valuing cost and ease of use can override considerations of accuracy and fairness. And therefore, design trade-offs based on value trade-offs can contribute to bias. Another example of how sampling and data collection methods can introduce bias is related to how people are recruited to studies. Although mistrust of research and researchers is commonly cited as a barrier to participation of underrepresented groups in precision medicine research or in research in general, medical research in general, that isn't necessarily the whole study. In a study of why African Americans say no to participation in pharmacogenomic research, the authors also found other relevant considerations, such as requiring uncomfortable procedures and fears of third-party access to genetic information. However, the study also identified aspects of recruitment processes that pose significant but potentially modifiable barriers to enrollment. That is, the bias can also be introduced by data collection data collection procedures and study design. So, for example, they found that requiring significant travel and having less flexible schedules are all factors that introduce bias into recruitment. The study also found that recruitment in the outpatient versus the inpatient setting, where people have fewer competing obligations and are already in site, could be a significant source of bias. The study's design could influence enrollment. There's a lot of activity now in understanding how bias is also embedded within the data themselves and leading to biases and predictions from those data. So I'm showing you a paper from a lab that found evidence for how bias can arise against marginalized populations from the use of natural language processing in clinical applications. So these authors trained word embedding models on unstructured clinical notes in the MIMIC3 database, which is a large, freely available database comprising de-identified health-related data associated with over 40,000 patients who stayed in critical care units of Beth Israel Medical Center. So this is a good example of data sharing, but as we will see, it is not free of bias. This figure from their paper shows the results of a fill-in-the-blank task and how the model generates different courses of action for different races based on the actions described in the clinic notes. So in this example of NLP bias, they also found differences in model performance of genders, ethnicities, language speakers, and insurance statuses, as well as by racial categories. So you can see here, when asked to fill in the blank, the algorithm takes the input of white patient and says that it predicts that based on existing data in the MIMIC3 database, that the white patient became belligerent and violent and was sent to the hospital, whereas an African American or Black patient who might have become belligerent or violent gets filled in the blank as being sent to prison. So fundamentally, it's important to recognize, even though data are presented as objective, they are created through processes that are highly subjective. That is, they're affected by personal views, experiences, and backgrounds. They are increasingly being used to represent complex systems, such as organs or entire humans. However, data are necessarily a subset of and vastly simplified representations of the real world, and by nature only able to represent selected characteristics of that world. So how these selections are made and who makes them are anything but objective and the product of socially complex systems. So another way of saying that more simply was how Hannah Davis said it in an article that she published in Towards Data Science. And what she said was, a data set is a worldview. The power of data decisions to shape, distort, or misrepresent worldviews can be seen here literally in the comparison of two different depictions of the world map, both of which represent three-dimensional space in 2 dimensions, here taken from Wikipedia. On the left is a Mercator projection, which we are most familiar with, which prioritized the needs of European navigators traveling to other continents during a major era of colonization in the 1500s by facilitating more accurate calculation of compass headings. While the Gall-Peters projection on the right, which was developed in the 1800s and 1900s, claimed to be an area-correct representation. The Mercator projection in inflating the size of objects near the poles was criticized for distorting land masses. Well, so while Greenland appears roughly the same size as Africa, it is actually 14 times smaller. These representations could affect how people think about these land masses, for example, because of cognitive biases in studies that have identified showing that that have showed that people interpret larger objects to be more important than smaller ones. So in making a design trade-off or by formulating the problem to be solved differently, these two different maps reflect different values trade-offs. Other worldviews might put the South up or center the Pacific Ocean or even the geographic North Pole. Alternative ways of representing the world reveals biases of the people who made the maps and also shows how any choice a map maker makes forces a trade-off because no one can represent everything equally for all purposes. So the Gall-Peters projection focuses on accurate representation of area, but in doing so still distorts the shape of land masses, stretching the areas near the poles horizontally and areas near the equator vertically. It also reveals how choosing a map is also choosing a set of values or worldviews. And such a choice was illustrated in 2017 when the Boston Public Schools adopted the Gall-Peters projection, which de-emphasized Europe and North America and the European-centered colonialist values that were embedded in the Mercator projection. So where do these worldviews come from? Scholar Sabina Leonelli said that for any data set, several individuals, sometimes hundreds of them, are involved in deciding how to produce the data in the first place. And data production is produced through the fragmented rather than coordinated efforts of several different groups of researchers. And this lack of coordination also creates challenges for identifying potential sources of misrepresentation or bias. This schematic from the NIH Office of Data Science Strategy attempts to capture the complexity of data production and handling as it exists for modern biomedical research, where data sets exist within larger repositories, which exist within larger ecosystems that include distributed tools, data workers, and community of users and data donors. An example of one of the key activities in a data system is data annotation. For artificial intelligence applications, this is the process of labeling data according to the outcomes that a supervised or semi-supervised machine learning model is meant to identify or predict, and often is outsourced by modelers. Outsourcing is typically directed to countries where labor costs are generally low and to people who do not have specialized medical backgrounds in order to further control costs. In this study by Milagros Miceli and colleagues that studied data annotation for computer vision, they found that classification tasks were highly subjective and open to interpretation. So for example, the annotators were instructed to assign labels to human faces according to the annotator's judgment of variables such as sex, and they were given only two choices to assign, male or female, age, and then they were given four choices of categories to assign to the human faces, 0 to 2, 2 to 16, 16 to 65, or over 65, and ethnicity, and I'm using ethnicity in quotes because that's what the annotators were given. And again, they were given categories, as seen here, including Caucasian, which is an inappropriate category that you should not use anymore, but this is what was given to the annotators. So Miceli and her colleagues found that in another case, data annotators were not told the source of image data or the purpose of the data set or asked about whether they found ambiguities in their classification tasks. And if you think about these classification tasks, they are highly ambiguous. How do you know whether, if you given a human face, whether that person is 65-year-old, less than 65-year-old, or more than 65 years old? So there was little communication between the annotators and the people that hired them, nor did there appear to be attempts at quality control. So the process of creating data that is so fundamental to AI and to science is prone to systematic error, but left largely unmonitored or uncontrolled. Here's another example of how data are categorized in the first place, being the product of value-based decisions. In this case, decisions that were made by clinicians largely. So while clinical expertise is necessary to understanding how bias is embedded in data, clinicians can also contribute to bias. While many others have demonstrated how clinician bias can lead to misplacement of patients into diagnostic or treatment categories, this example shows how clinician bias affects the construction of the categories themselves. So, for example, the American College of Medical Genetics recently released carrier screening guidelines that were meant to address and improve equitable distribution of the benefits of genetic screening. And these guidelines expanded the populations that were recommended to get genetic screening for conditions that were associated with specific subpopulations, such as cystic fibrosis in those of Northern European ancestry, or sickle cell disease in those of African ancestry, and recognize that these populations are not accurately reflective of who is likely to be or who can be a carrier of the associated genes. Although these were well-intentioned, the guidelines were criticized for falling short, in part because of how disease severity was defined. And disease severity is typically a key factor in screening criteria, as well as disease prevalence and other kinds of variables. So in a blog last year, genetic counselors Katie Stoll and Robert Resta noted that it's concerning that this study puts conditions that are associated with intellectual disability in the same group as those that are associated with death in infancy or early childhood. Also, if we look across the lifespan, many, if not most of us, will experience some features that could be counted in the severe and or moderate buckets. Stoll and Resta went on to critique how the categories of disease severity were derived, being based on a limited survey of healthcare providers, and that were conducted by the company Council, now Myriad Genetics. This survey was limited to the medical genetics community, including genetic counselors and physicians, and did not include those with lived experience with the conditions included on the ACMG panel. Clinical expertise is important for mitigating AI bias. It's also important to recognize how bias is baked into data because its very existence is shaped by values and worldviews, typically those of researchers. And those values and worldviews may not be shared by the public or other important stakeholders. So as an example of how lived experience and identity are important for shaping views about data, I wanted to highlight this article that was written by 4 scholars who self-identify as multiracial, and also give a shout out to my 2 postdoctoral fellows, Daphne Marchenko and Jenny Young, who are 2 of the authors on this paper. And they pointed out how the idea of racial purity creates data bias because it leaves out those who are perceived to fall out of arbitrarily defined boundaries of so-called pure races, as data from people who are of mixed race are typically removed from genetic analysis in the name of quality control as outliers. This is therefore an obvious way to exacerbate health disparities, but one that is perpetrated by the false notion of discrete categories such as race, and that only data belonging to these categories are considered valid and included in analysis. So finally, I just want to point out that there are external factors that influence values about data. So in a study of machine learning developers that I and my colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania and Stanford recently conducted, we heard statements about the influence of external factors that can shape experiences, such as disciplinary norms in computer science, and how business considerations could affect decisions about design and implementation that could have an impact on mitigating bias. And these influences were described in a way that is not only external, but pervasive and maybe even inevitable. So you can see here from the quotes, people talk about a disconnect in the ethos of the computer science business, and says that the cost, it's built around the notion of tolerance to failure, where the cost of doing it may be cheap, so we can fail and move on and do another one, which is antithetical to medicine. And this person goes on to say, you're not allowed to fail with people. The second machine learning developer said that hospital systems, when they're choosing and selecting the vendors, that when they're trying to purchase a AI-based system, not just the ones they're going to purchase, but the ones they're going to keep, saving lives is something that matters to them, but financials matter a lot, and maybe sometimes more. So even if you can show that you can lower their mortality rate 20%, that may not actually save them money, and they may actually go with a vendor that does. So this just points to that these values are not sort of in a vacuum around the data, but in the context of much larger sort of systems of data use and research. So I'm just going to finish up there. Hope there's time for some questions, and I hope I've given you some food for thought for your small group discussions. I've given you some value examples that are involved in data generation, collection, and sharing, and how sometimes those values are in tension and thus subject to trade-off. So in addition, I've also introduced that stakeholders in data management and sharing go beyond researchers and funders, and that fulfilling responsibility to other stakeholders might include engagement with communities about benefits and governance, as well as about risks, because we shouldn't assume that researchers' values are in alignment with those of other stakeholders. And finally, I've also introduced the concept of data ecosystems and hope that I've encouraged you to think about how data sets, especially in large centralized repositories, are generated and influenced by many people, including those who do not share their data, and how each of those different parties of influence have the potential for introducing bias individually as well as collectively. So with that, I think I will end there, and we can move on to questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Mildred. That was wonderful. Gave us a lot of food for thought, a lot of terrific examples there. We have had one question come in. I want to encourage people who are listening, if you have thoughts or questions with regard to Dr. Cho's presentation, this is your time to put those into the Q&A box. Oh, good, and they're starting to come. Oh, Jonathan Kokarnik. Hi, Jonathan. Long time no see. Anyway, let's start with Tim. Tim says, your talk has been so powerful, makes me wonder, is a data-first approach to science where hypotheses emerge from the data, and you made a reference to this, I think, early on in your presentation, is it even possible? Or is such an approach doomed from the start? What do you think about that?
Well, so yeah, this is the topic. This could be a whole other topic, right? Like we could talk for hours just about that. But there's sort of a moment some years ago where I think during the big data boom, when people were starting to be able to accumulate and combine large data sets, and people were getting in the heady space of big data, that people were starting to say, well, you know what, we don't have to do science the way we usually do anymore, right? Like first you like make observations, then you make hypotheses, you generate the hypotheses, you test the hypotheses, and then you go around again, right? So we can just circumvent all that, and it's much cheaper to just like get a bunch of data, and then we don't need hypotheses because we have AI now, and that will create the hypotheses for us, right? So I'm very skeptical of that, because I think you've seen, and I think people are starting to realize, when you take data that are already existing, even aside from the fact that the data already have embedded biases in them, that, you know, basically, logically speaking, you can only recreate what you already have, right? You can't actually get new knowledge from data that you already collected in the past. Or, you know, you can see what I mean. So I think that there's a logical flaw in the argument of using this data first approach, but I don't know, a lot of people have invested a lot of money in it. So
they have,
I'd be
right.
wrong.
Yeah, so it is a very interesting and intriguing question, and perhaps one that can be talked about and argued about more in the discussion groups. Thank you for that response. The next question, which comes from Jonathan Kokarnik, how should informed consent practices adapt in the context of open data? The more available the data, the less likely a researcher or a research participant may be able to predict and consent to any future use or consequence. By contrast, restrictions on availability may constrain the potential uses or benefits of open data. So how do we think about the sort of trade-offs involved there?
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, Malia, you should probably answer that question. That's right in your wheelhouse. But, you know, I mean, seriously, please go ahead if you have.
Well, I mean, I do think it
do.
is a really interesting and important question, right? And I think one of the reflections that I have from your presentation, Mildred, is like, and I think you so clearly laid out like all of these sort of competing considerations, right? And then you plop a juniorish trainee into the mix, right? Where you're trying to sort of do the right thing. It looks like widely open access data is the way to go. And yet it raises all kinds of concerns, and you address these about the canonical example, the Havasu Pai case, where people basically agreed to participate in research for the benefit of their communities and on a particular understanding, and something very different happened. And that's just, and there's a whole bunch of cultural pressures right now coming from the funders on down to make data widely accessible, widely available, freely, go and get it. And the second you do, you kind of lose control of what people can be doing with that data. And then you end up with some of the strange things that have been happening with very large data sets like the UK Biobank, and like that study that ended up with an app predicting how gay you might be, for example. I mean, so there's really weird things that can come about. And yet I think the policymakers have decided that more access on balance is better, as long as we who are the data donors are okay with that. And maybe that's a little bit, Jonathan, of what you're getting at, is how much the data donors really understand how open the data could possibly be.
Yeah, and I think that, the CARE principles that I showed you are kind of an indicator of what happens when, informed consent basically fails, right? And so then what that's led to is this sort of alternative framework, which is basically like taking the control back, right? And saying you had control, but we don't trust you now, so we're going to take control, and then now the burden's on you more than the burden's on us to understand what the informed consent is. So I think they're sort of flipping the script there, and you can see there's clearly advantages in terms of how it conserves the values of the indigenous populations or the people who control the data. But we are running into the problem then of, if you still have the run into the wall of not being able to derive maximal benefit, even for the indigenous people, if they're not able to combine that data with other data sets, right? Right. So yeah. I think it's sort of, it's just emblematic of the conundrum.
Yes, it really is. And as Jonathan reflects, it's a big ask, particularly when considered in an equity lens. Yeah. Maybe we got like 1 minute left. There's a couple of other provocative questions, but oh gosh, I'm not even sure we have time for any of these. There's an interesting one about biosecurity and thinking about sort of sharing data and preventing misuse that might come from wider access to data. Do you have any thoughts on that? It's sort of a last point.
Oh yeah, that's a tough one.
That's a tough one in 1 minute, I know.
Yeah, it's a tough one, but I do think that it is another angle here, which is another sort of set of values that sort of mitigates against the data, the open data sharing issue, and that has come up with like DIY bio, for example, right? And I think that also means that in addition to sort of like the other that there needs to be some attention to that part of the responsibilities on scientists are not just to sort of look at privacy and security and data use in the sense that is it honoring sort of the consent of the data donors or that sort of thing, but also sort of thinking forward to how might these data be used in ways that are for nefarious uses that we hope I mean, I think you're sort of seeing this with COVID, right? I mean,
yes.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
no, and it's a very, and it, this notion that we might want to censor data or, publications in some ways very,
right.
nobody wants to do that, but how to think about this carefully and clearly. I mean,
Yeah. And there are sort of structures for that,
Mhm.
and how to think those things through. But
Mhm.
and also if you're working with you know some of the like polio or poliovirus, there's actually a lot of structures around that.
Yes.
But I think there's a lot of people who are working on things that are not so clearly like pathogens that
Mhm.
also need to be thinking about that and thinking through sort of how to avoid this dual use problem, which I
Yeah.
mean, and it can be done, but it does mean sort of forward thinking a little more than we're typically used to doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, sadly, we have come to the end of our time. Thank you so much again, Mildred, for being with us and giving that wonderful presentation about sort of data responsibilities and data sharing and data bias. We really have appreciated you being with us today. So thank you again. Bravo. For people who are helping us as volunteer facilitators, we are going to have our kind of optional 30-minute discussion with Tim Brown and I to just talk about some of the themes that came up in the lecture today. So if you're interested in staying on for that, feel free. Otherwise, thank you very much for being here, and we hope you have a good rest of your day. And for those of you here in the Pacific Northwest, stay cool. Thanks.